Hello Year 10. Welcome to the third and final context lesson. Ms. Malt here. This is the last time you're going to be hearing my dulcet tones for a while. Make sure and you will need to have something to record your notes on, whether a book, lined paper or a Word document. You should have the contextual presentation opened up in front of you, but also the contextual notebook that you should have, the booklet. You need to have your folder with your Macbeth English literature work area so you can save things where it is. And this is the third of three, the last one. Did I say that before? And this one is kind of a random collection of other things. This is about women, knights, and PTSD. Okay, make sure that you've got all that you need and move on when you are ready. Women and that apple. Now, do you remember last time what I was saying about women not being allowed on the stage to perform? Well, that's not the only thing that women were controlled over. And this sense of control actually goes back to religion and the idea of original sin. Now, this refers to the Christian belief in the universal nature of sin. Sin, that one big thing that the church gets rather heated up over. Sin came to the world after Adam and Eve behaved very badly in the Garden of Eden, and Christians believe that ever since that time, all people are born sinful. And because sin is something that we're born with and we carry throughout our lives, the only way we can be free of sin is through living good and well-behaved lives. Religion was much more important to society at the time of Shakespeare, and the idea of original sin living within us would have been a commonly held belief. And it was also a commonly held belief that this original sin was the fault of Eve, the woman. No one else, of course. Don't blame the serpent who was actually trying to tempt her. I hope that you all know the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent, where Eve is tempted by the serpent to take and eat an apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the one tree that God has told them to leave alone, and how she shares that apple with Adam, and as a punishment God throws them out of the Garden of Eden. There is more detail about this story in your context booklet if you need to refresh your memories or you've never heard of it before. The one thing to take away though is women in the 1600s had quite a miserable time of it, really. They had few legal rights and the work that they could actually do was quite limited. So they had jobs like spinning cloth, or they were milliners or dyers and embroiderers, laundry washerwomen. Sometimes they worked for brewers or bakers or confectioners. They would sell foodstuffs in the street. Most of them was as a domestic servant, which basically was a maid, where they worked very hard work in someone's household for long hours every day, starting very early, finishing quite late. A few women were midwives or apothecaries. Most women had a very basic education. They focused on what they had to be able to understand and do to look after the home and the people who lived in there. So most women were housewives, and they were kept very busy, just as modern housewives are. Men who ran farms and businesses needed their help. And in towns, some young girls would go to what they called a dame school, and they were taught to read, which could be quite useful for their husbands. If you lived in the countryside in the 1600s, most of those households were self-sufficient. If there was a servant, then the housewife would have a little bit of help, but she had to do practically everything. She had to bake her family's bread, she had to brew the beer, it's not safe to drink the water. She was also responsible for curing bacon from the pigs that they would raise themselves, salting meat, making pickles, preserves, jellies, everything that they could to preserve as much food that they produced as possible, because there was no other way of doing it. Very often in the countryside, the housewife also made candles and soap from that process of curing meat, etc. They spun wool and linen, and if there was a farmer's wife, then she would be milking the cows, feeding the animals, as well as growing herbs and vegetables in the garden. She often kept bees as well. She took goods to the market to sell, so that with the money they could buy things that they couldn't produce for themselves. On top of that, of course, she had to cook every day, she had to wash the family's clothes, she had to keep the house clean, she had to have children and look after them as well as the husband. The housewife was also supposed to have some knowledge of medicine and be able to treat her family's illnesses, and this was often through what we would now call herbal remedies. She would go to the wise woman if she couldn't do it herself. Only the wealthy could afford a doctor. Now, you don't need to make many notes from this slide because actually this isn't the kind of lifestyle that our principal character, Lady Macbeth, has in the play that we're doing. Lady Macbeth has quite a different kind of lifestyle, but you need to just be aware of how women were considered. In the 16th and 17th century, marriages were usually arranged for the convenience of the family, not for love, but not for the poor. The poor, you ended up with whoever you could get. Divorce was absolutely unknown. Legally, you could marry from the age of 12 years old. However, it was only girls from rich families who married young. Majority of women were married by their mid-20s. Women were viewed as being very much inferior to men. They were not given the same amount of respect, and they did not have the same rights as them either. Basically, in Elizabethan times, as a woman, you belonged first of all to your father, or your brother if your father was dead, and then to your husband. Women could not own property of their own, and this is considered to be one of the reasons why Queen Elizabeth never married. She didn't want to give up her power to a man. If she'd married, she would have had to have handed over her position to her husband. Women were totally dominated by males of the family, and they were expected to obey all of those males of the family, not just the father or the elder brother, the younger brother, the uncle, any other male member of the family as well. And the punishment for disobedience was a good beating. It was considered a sin to disobey any male member of the family. Women were also bound by strict social expectations that did not apply equally to men. In fact, at the time, it was actually better, probably, to be of lower born birth than to be of an upper class family. Because if you were working class, then you actually got more freedom because no one saw you as being important at all. Women were often regarded as being unable to control emotions. We find in Shakespeare, actually, that women in power are treated by Shakespeare with distrust. They are seen to have questionable morals. For example, Lady Macbeth literally manipulates and coerces her husband into the murder of King Duncan. She's not the only powerful, bad woman in Shakespeare, but the women who are like that show a lust for power as often as bad or even worse than that of the men that they are linked to. Lady Macbeth is seen as have a conflict between her masculinity and her femininity. She seems to forego normal feminine traits like motherly compassion, and yet she is highly masculine in her ambition. And it's her ambition to become a queen, that she can only achieve by being the wife of the man who becomes king, leads to the ruin of her family. For her, within the play, Shakespeare gives her the penalty of her scheming ways through a rather miserable death. Queen Elizabeth I. Ironically, Shakespeare grew up and lived and wrote and worked for the majority of his life under a woman on the throne, and an unmarried woman at that. So in spite of the fact that this was a very male-centred, a patriarchal society at the time, the ruler was a woman. Throughout her reign, there were many debates over whether or not a woman could rule as effectively as a man. And Elizabeth had to prove herself again and again through all of this male doubt. There's one famous speech that she made, and she was speaking to her troops just before a Spanish invasion. She assured them, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Weak and feeble woman. So that was generally how women were seen. Yet, in spite of all of that, Elizabeth enjoyed a very long and politically very stable reign, and she demonstrated just how effective a female ruler could be. And it could be possible that her success as a queen inspired other women to demand more freedom within their marriage. Certainly the period between 1595 and 1620, there was a huge increase in the number of disputes and separations among the aristocratic wives and husbands. However, the rise in women's dissatisfaction over the way their marriages constrained them also gave rise to the concept of the shrew. And Shakespeare, bless him, even wrote a play called The Taming of the Shrew. Now, a shrew is an aggressively assertive woman who speaks her mind, not considered to be a good thing. So this trope of the shrew in turn reinvigorated the idea that men had to keep their women under control. Husbands had to discipline their wives, and again that renewed the whole patriarchal normal society. Whatever women did, essentially, they couldn't win. Pause if you have to, go back over any of these slides on women if you need to. We're about to move on to the second of these two topics, topic of knights and the Code of Chivalry. We all probably have a sense of an idea about knights. The man in shining armour on top of his white horse, seeking to save people, particularly ladies and damsels in distress. And that image comes from this Code of Chivalry that was very long-standing in this country. How did you become a knight, though? It didn't just happen. It was a position that you had to aspire to and achieve. It wasn't just handed out willy-nilly. So a man had to have a really excellent reputation, had to have proved himself as suitable to become a knight. The rank of knight was considered to be important. It was something to be worked towards. It was something that you had to honour and respect, as indeed other people did. And perhaps it was a way of controlling young men at the time, to make them follow this particular 10 commandments, the Code of Chivalry, to make them behave properly. Who knows? So some of the things that men who were made knights had to swear to was to be loyal, generous, of noble bearing, well-behaved, nice, pleasant young men. They were required to tell the truth at all times and always respect the honour of women. If they said no, they meant no. Knights not only vowed to protect the weak, but they also vowed to guard the honour of all fellow knights. So it was like kind of a friendship group, a deeply controlled friendship group. They always had to obey those who were placed in authority, such as a king, and they were never allowed to refuse a challenge from an equal. So if some other knight challenged you to a duel, you could not insult them by saying no. Knights had to live by honour, but they were also seeking glory. And the glory was not for them, but the glory was for their king, for God, for the church. On the next slide, you'll see just a couple of images to go with this period. You need just a few notes about what knights could and couldn't do. When you've done that, so here we have the Code of Chivalry, which is a code of honour. It was an important part of society and lives of the people. And this Code of Chivalry was admired, and more importantly, it was understood by everyone. So it wasn't just an oral thing, there was a written document. And the written document would have things such as those below. So the Code of Chivalry, fair play, nobility, honour. You had to have the skills, the virtues that they thought were important. The image on the right-hand side below shows a knight with due deference and humility, getting some kind of reward from the woman, the damsel there, and he's got his horse, his trusty steed, ready to go off and do the task that she had probably given him to do. Okay, let's move on. So what's chivalry got to do with Macbeth? Absolutely. At the start of the play, Macbeth is conveyed as a brave warrior. He is a man who keeps by the Code of Chivalry. He has been fighting honourably with determination and valour for his country and for his king. Macbeth, the warrior, is presented as a very admirable and a very moral, just person. He is respected by all of his companions, and because of his valour on the battlefield, he is rewarded for his bravery, and that reward comes from his king, King Duncan. Now remember, the code demands that a knight shows loyalty to the king, protection of a guest, and honour in death. Now let's think a little bit about Macbeth. I know you've not studied the play yet, but basically Macbeth chooses to kill King Duncan. He could say no, but he doesn't. He is persuaded by Lady Macbeth and goes against his initial instinct. His initial instinct is actually Duncan is good. He's a kind, virtuous, honest king. Why would he kill him? He's just honoured him. He's just given him a new title as a reward for being so chivalrous in battle. And yet Macbeth murders the king. So he doesn't show loyalty, and he doesn't protect him either. When he kills King Duncan, Duncan is actually his guest in Macbeth's own castle. So he breaks two codes straight away in that thing. That one action takes away everything that is established at the beginning when he was seen to be such a brave and honourable knight for his king. Make a few notes, please. Pause this and carry on once you're ready. We're about to go on to the third section. PTSD, the consequences of battle. As we've just mentioned, the play Macbeth opens with Scotland at war. Immediately before the first scene, the war has just been won by Scotland. Macbeth is the hero of the day. Everyone is talking about him. War must affect everyone who's involved with it. War at that time was very intense. It was very intimate. Your enemy, your foe, was there right in front of you, and your weapon, a sword, literally brought you very close to the action. You would be less than 2 meters away from your enemy. You would have that knowledge of what they were feeling from the way they were screaming in agony. You'd be splattered with their blood, and you would see very closely what you were doing to another human being. And you would have to do this time and time again, surrounded by other people doing exactly the same thing, other compatriots, your comrades, also killing and being killed in this gruesome, violent, bloody way. We aren't told how long the war that Scotland's engaged in has been going on, but it's likely that it would have been over a matter of months, not days, and with each battle perhaps lasting a day. Not only would you have to kill or be killed, but you would do that many times. Imagine the trauma, the psychological trauma that would bring. In Shakespeare's time, of course, psychology wasn't a thing, but Shakespeare very carefully writes about the way characters react and behave, and their behaviour and their actions tell us a lot about the effects battle had on them. There might not have been a label for it at the time, but Shakespeare certainly wrote about characters who were suffering in all sorts of ways. Make 1 or 2 notes, please, and be ready to move on. I find it really helpful when teaching Macbeth, and I hope for my students who are listening to me as well, to think about Macbeth, the character, as a war veteran. He is someone who has come through a war, maybe more than one war. He's suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It is a modern concept for a state of mind that must have existed for all soldiers over many centuries. And in my mind, it helps me to understand Macbeth as I think that he is a character who shows many symptoms of his experience of war after the war is over. That is why, in my head, he reacts so badly when he has Duncan's blood on his hands, why he says he can't go back to the bedchamber. And ultimately the murder of Duncan becomes part of his trauma. He has been a soldier, he's killed many people. One more death shouldn't really be that big a deal, but it is. And what is it? Why is it that he reacts so strongly at Duncan's blood when he didn't perhaps on all those other people. The poster on the right tells you some of the symptoms of PTSD in our modern world. And you can see, as you go through the play, you can see that Shakespeare has written in some of these symptoms with Macbeth. Avoiding thinking of the actual thing that caused the trauma, trying to ignore it, is one thing that people with PTSD do. And yet they have flashbacks. They can't actually get it out of their heads. They can't concentrate on things. They think very negatively. They behave very negatively. They show feelings of shame or guilt. And yet, ironically, they're always on guard, very anxious, not able to rest or relax, always looking for the next thing. And part of the big thing about PTSD is this inability to sleep. And you'll hear quite a lot about sleep when you're talking about Macbeth. So Macbeth has bad dreams. Lady Macbeth has bad dreams. Difficult to sleep. He says he has murdered sleep. Sleep no more. Macbeth has murdered sleep. So I believe if we think about Macbeth as a war veteran, as suffering from PTSD, then we can explain quite a number of the things that he does and things that he says during the course of the play. Make a few notes before we move on. Now, it's possible that you don't actually really understand the way that I've described it. So if you want to have PTSD described and explained in a different way, there's a video here that I would recommend on YouTube. There are lots of videos about PTSD on YouTube. This one is just 4.5 minutes, relatively straightforward. It's called Understanding Mental Health, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, if you need to search for it because you can't get the... Right, let's go back to Macbeth and the battle and the hero then. So, the play opens at the end of a war. Victory for Scotland. All sounds brilliant, doesn't it? The play, we don't hear much about that other than one character telling us some of the highlights. So the captain tells us how well Macbeth performed in the battle, etc. Now, some film versions of the play try to show this in order to set the scene. And I think that there's a short section towards the beginning of the film of Macbeth with Michael Fassbender in it. This section is called The Battle of Elon, and I've given you here the YouTube site. Can I recommend that you watch it? But as you're watching it, be looking out for those things to do with sound, to do with the steel, the swords, the movement, the noise. There are parts of it which are kind of in slow motion or without the sound, and they perhaps more arty in that way. Think about how those characters in this film prepare for the battle. So the young men are having their swords literally tied to their hands so they can't drop them. So without their sword, they can't protect themselves. They're painting their faces with a very rudimentary war paint. The whole psychology about war paint is that it makes you feel stronger. It makes you feel more capable. It's like a protection. And also they're praying. They've got crosses, some of them. They are praying to God to help them. So I think that this short form and extract is quite a nice way of thinking about what Macbeth must be going through. When you watch it, you'll see that there's 4 odd characters standing to the side of the battle. They're supposed to be the witches. Just ignore them. It's just, again, another kind of arty-farty thing. Okay, have a look at that. It's worth it. Just as a warning, though, most films of Macbeth are bad, are really bad. They change too much, or they do it in a really kind of naff way. So don't watch too many films of Macbeth, please. We are able to identify particular bits of different films which work well. And of course, with many of the films, it will be put into modern day dress, which for some of you will just be a distraction rather than a help. Okay, that's the end of it. So what have we been through today? Women, knights and PTSD. Lovely collection. So in this session we've considered these 3 different contexts, and we've added them, I hope, to the context that we've looked at in the previous 2 sections. All of the contexts are useful to your understanding of the play. They try to help you to get into the motives for some of the characters' actions. They explain the societal ways that the people have, what was different in the 1600s to now, why things were as they were, what they believed in, what they thought, what they felt. There is actually quite a lot here for you to learn, but you don't need to learn it all. When you come to look at different parts of the play, you'll be guided to use some parts of this information. There are some parts of this which will really help you to understand. And I hope something like the PTSD will really make you think about, well, what was Macbeth feeling? What was he thinking? Why does he keep going on about this? It's because he can't get it out of his mind. If in doubt, though, ask. Your teacher will be happy to explain some of these to you again, to link the ideas from these contexts to the play, and to help you as we work on through this text. Can I just suggest, though, that you start as you need to go on? So go over the notes you've made in your booklet from these 3 different sessions. Underline some of the details that you feel are really important, that you may need to know. And the best thing you can do right now is to ensure your notes are complete, but also that when you read through them, you understand them. So you're not questioning what you've done. Go back over any of the 3 lessons if you need to, and also ask questions, but make sure your notes are usable for the future. So that's me over and out for these 3 sessions. I hope that you enjoy the play, and I look forward to seeing some of the things that you do about it later on. Enjoy! Bye then!